Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. So we've had another week and yet another report attacking the austerity plans of the Conservatives that have been described elsewhere as variously both cruel and brainless. Cruel because the policies have plunged UK citizens into poverty, making millions of lives a misery and even killing people due to directly attributable causes. Brainless because they didn't even deliver the stated aims and never could. On the face of it, austerity was an easy sell to people who don't think it through. After all, the country was recovering from the effects of a global recession, which the Conservatives now admit, but at the time blamed Labour as it was concentrated in Britain. Apparently, this global recession that was affecting everyone else, oh no, it's only in Britain. And when you think about it on a personal level, what do you do when your income has suddenly decreased? You tighten your belt and you do without a few luxuries. And that all seemed perfectly reasonable logic and people went along with it. However, it wasn't really thought through. Not only did the Conservative government do away with things that are actually essentials, not luxuries, but they tried to put out the idea that we were broke as a country, but we somehow managed to find enough money to give billions in tax cuts to the already wealthy, while shafting every government department already trimmed down by the last Labour government with 25% cuts across the board. And that was just for starters. But the cutbacks weren't an example of tightening our belts. Not giving tax breaks to the rich would have been an example of that. Not pumping silly amounts of money into privatisation would have been another example. What we did was the equivalent of quitting your job so you can save on the petrol you use to drive to work. What a government needs to do in the wake of an economic crash is exactly what Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were doing, investing in the country to keep industries going. This is what the UK began doing, and it's what some other economies did as well. So if we have a look at UK national debt as a proportion of its GDP, this is how it has looked. So from 1995 there up to 2016. Just because that's the graph I found, it's actually not gone down since 2016, I have to say. So you look at it in isolation and what you see is it rising sharply under the back end of the Labour government after that 2008 crash. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that the continued rise under the Conservatives was just a continuation of that. I mean, no evidence here that Tory policies are to blame for our record national debt. No, if you just look at it in isolation, absolutely. But look what happens when we compare it with Germany. Okay, so with Germany, the national debt also rose sharply after the recession, but it was brought back down under control and started declining quickly from 2013. It is now back down to pre-recession figures as a proportion of their GDP. As an absolute value, it's still high, but their GDP has increased because they invested in their economy. Now, the UK wasn't the only country to borrow its way out of trouble but failed to get to grips with it. A number of other economies have done the same, including France and the US. So what Germany did that was very different and in line with what the UK were doing before 2010, and the real worst UK Prime Minister stepped up to the crease, was invest in its own industries and not shovel money into the dusty vaults of the already wealthy. And what are the knock-on effects of this? There are mainly three. One, if you shovel the wealth of the nation into the hands of the already fabulously wealthy, that money does nothing for the economy. There is no trickle-down effect because it doesn't get spent. And when it doesn't get spent in this country. When you give it to ordinary people through investment in industry, not only does it benefit far more people, but that money does get spent. It carries on circulating in the country's economy. Now, the Conservatives kept moaning at the people they were giving the money to for not circulating it back into the economy. Rather than actually directing that money where it should have gone, they still kept giving it to their wealthy mates and then moaned at them when they didn't spend it. What good did that do? The second effect is that by contracting the economy, a massive number of jobs are lost with much lower productivity. That means the country doesn't make as much money as a whole. That means that the tax receipts are lower and not compensated by the tax receipts from the people the government are actually giving the money to because they let them get away without paying their taxes properly. Business rates go down as well, not as productive, not as much in the way of business rates. So both the National Treasury and local councils find themselves with massive budget deficits. And the third effect, because loads of people now don't have a wage, or at least a living wage, the costs of benefits rises. That puts even more pressure on government expenditure at a time when their policies have reduced their own income. So they're getting hit from both sides. So like I said, this wasn't like doing away with a Friday takeaway when your income has suffered. It's literally quitting your job to save on petrol. It's that level. And it's important to note that the debt figures I'm referring to are as a proportion of GDP and not absolute values. That's important for two reasons. First of all, the actual debt value is always going to be higher with a wealthier nation. You can't then compare with other nations. That's how it works with people, and it's how it works with nations. And the second reason is the actual value of debt is only good or bad compared to income, productivity. For example, if you're bringing home £1,000 a month and your mortgage is £800 a month, that's not really sustainable debt. But someone bringing home £4,000 a month can easily manage a mortgage of £800 a month. So expressing debt as a proportion of GDP is the only sane measure, and that's why that's the measure you'll mostly see. And it's another reason why the Conservatives exposed their economic ignorance, because they behaved as if there's only one way to reduce debt: cut back. But that's not true. Just as with an individual whose income takes a knock, there is another way: make more money. Fellow teachers have seen real-term cuts to their wages since the Conservatives came to power. For years, there was no increase to wages at all, as indeed has been the case with a lot of other public sector workers. And even since, the rises have been well below the level of inflation. So in terms of what most workers in the country can afford, it's way less than 9 years ago. In fact, recent figures have shown that the cost of government austerity as compared to investing in our economy means that the average family is earning £3,600 less than it would have been. And that's an average family, £300 a month worse off than just because of this nonsense that's been allowed to be talked of as necessary. But in my case, I did YouTube, and as a result, I haven't had to rely on the below inflationary increases. Thank you very much. Now, another thing that the Conservatives got badly wrong is that they focused on the deficit, and they focused the public's view on the deficit. This is the difference, of course, between what the government takes in tax receipts and what it spends. Now, I'm not suggesting you ignore the deficit. Of course, you don't want to be spending more than you earn, ideally, even as a nation. But the problem with this focus for a bunch of ministers who knew nothing about economics is that there's an easy way to make the figure go down. You cut expenditure and borrow. This had the dual effect of shrinking our economy and raising our national debt to record highs from which it is not returning. And here's where Brexit comes in. If we do leave with no deal, the economy will shrink still further. It can't not. That will inevitably tip our debt as a proportion of GDP above the symbolically awful figure of 100%. Nothing will stop that. It's already over 80%. And the Conservatives will keep on with their austerity plan of cutting back on spending, which shrinks the economy even more, and still finding the money to shovel into the pockets of their friends and donors when they get them back, that is. But just as with everything else the government does to screw us over, the media are failing in their duty to properly report this as well. So they'll carry on being able to go on with this narrative, and it'll just get worse and worse because they haven't got the ability to see how damaging it is. So anyway, hope you found that video interesting, if a little awful. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content. Until next time, I'll see you later.